Examination Day. Of all the stories that we did on the Twilight Zone, over the years I have heard more comments about this one than any other. I'm Phil DeGuere, I wrote the teleplay, and I've been surprised at the reactions that I've heard from this segment. The story was taken from a rather obscure short story by Henry Slezar that was published, I think, in the 50s. One of the things that was so unusual about the Twilight Zone for television was that we were able to tell stories at whatever length the stories wanted to be told. Most television shows require that the stories be either 24 minutes if it's a half an hour or 48 minutes if it's an hour. And one of the freedoms that we felt, really made the show unique was that we could do a show like this, which was only 10 minutes long. It also seemed as if it was going to be a fairly classic Twilight Zone, in which the central character, the young boy, is not really aware of what's going on. His parents, on the other hand, are. And therefore, as the story unfolds and the boy's optimism is contrasted with some rather nervous and dark looks that come from his parents, we have the uneasy sense that things are not what they seem. Most of the comments that I've heard over the years came from people who were in school, probably college or maybe high school at the time. The assumption, of course, going into the story, is that this is a test like any other normal test, and the object of the test is to do the best job you can on it. What's particularly subversive about this little story is that when the boy actually gets to the testing facility, he's given a liquid to drink. And as we'll see when we get to that part, the administration of this liquid is designed to make it impossible for the subject to pretend that he is less intelligent than he really is.
We were hoping that you hadn't heard about it yet.
This story still has a very strong impact. I showed it to my 10-year-old daughter not too long ago, and she was as caught by surprise as the people who saw it when we originally aired it was. The motif, of course, is classic dystopia, a future in which, things are gray and dark, not unlike Blade Runner, perhaps, where it rains all the time.
Is it like a test at school?
We probably weren't, all that on top of exactly where technology was going when we did the show. Certainly that television set that we just showed was nothing like the kinds of sets that we have today. But still, the basic images of the future are, classic. It's really an excellent example of a science fiction story with a twist that you're not expecting at the end.
Please stop worrying about it. You'll be fine.
The story is disturbing, and it's meant to be. And that brings up something that I think may have been the major problem with the Twilight Zone. I was the executive producer of the revival, and when I was first approached by CBS to do it, I asked one thing only, and that was that the show be aired at 10 o'clock at night. CBS agreed to that, and we went ahead and for a year we developed and actually shot episodes before the time came for CBS to schedule the show. To my horror, in May of 1985, I got a telephone call from the network saying that they had decided to schedule the show at Friday night, 8 p.m. 8 o'clock was always a really difficult time period, especially back in the 80s. And that was still in a period in which there was a concept called the family hour. The idea being that shows that aired between 8 and 9 o'clock should not have violent or sexual content to them and should be basically suitable for viewing by the whole family. And you got to remember that back in those days there were only 3 networks. And in those days you could usually expect about a third of all of the audience to be watching one of those 3 networks unless there was a show that was a big hit. I was very disappointed that CBS had scheduled the show at 8 o'clock. And I pointed out to them that we had already shot, probably at least 6 or 8 episodes, and that some of these episodes were probably not particularly suitable for 8 o'clock viewing, but what were we going to do about it? We couldn't afford to throw that film away. We needed to make our air dates. And as a consequence, the show did air as we had originally produced it. I don't remember us making any particular adjustments because of the 8 o'clock time slot, and certainly a story like this, there wasn't any adjustment that we could make anyway. This story was what it was. So it's 8 o'clock on a Friday evening, and you're sitting down with your family to watch this new television series. And what do you find but a story in which the government kills children who are too smart? I think this sets up a uncomfortable factor in the minds of a lot of people in the audience. It was something that I was very worried about. The initial ratings on The Twilight Zone were very, very good. In those days, a television show needed to have about a 30 share in order to be successful, and Twilight Zone did in fact achieve a 30 share in most of its early runs. But little by little, I think stories like this, which were designed to make people uncomfortable, may have had an effect on a significant portion of the audience. And there is another episode called Nightcrawlers, which I also wrote from a short story by Robert R. McCammon and which was directed by Billy Friedkin, which has been, at least at the time, called the most intense piece of work that anybody had ever seen on network television. I do think, and I will make a commentary, or you'll be able to hear a commentary about that show if you want to, that there was a significant drop in the ratings of the show after that one aired. That one was probably just too much for the 8 o'clock, 8:30 television audience. Things have changed. Obviously, nowadays, the audience is used to things like The X-Files and Buffy the Vampire Slayer, shows that are, blatant in their violence and, designed to be as scary as possible. But at this point, I don't think most people who watched it realized exactly what the point of that little potion that they gave the boy was.
Why wouldn't I?
And so there's a sense of impending dread that builds in the course of the story and makes you wonder, well, just exactly what is it that's going on here? And I particularly like the look of the young actor who portrayed the boy, his enthusiasm, his optimism, his, intention to do the best that he could possibly do is very much in keeping with, what I think we'd like all our kids to be like under these circumstances. But this is a dark and probably somewhat prophetic look at a future society in which people who are too smart cannot be tolerated. One of the best things about science fiction has always been its ability to have us take a look at what's really going on around us in the world today. Stories that take place in the future are more often than not really about what's happening in the present. And you can make a comment about what's going on in the present if you set a story in the future or if you set it in a fantasy situation. And the comment can be considerably more effective than if you were to try to tell the same story within a realistic, natural kind of approach as if it were happening today. So at this stage of the game, as this story unfolds and as these two very nervous parents listen to the official word that comes back from the government, I think that there is a genuine sense of horror at the realization that in this particular world, you'll be far better off if you're just average. I'm Phil DeGuere, and I hope you enjoyed our adaptation of Henry Slesar's short story, Examination Day.
According to Rule 84, Section 5 of the new code, you may specify now whether you wish his body interred by the government or would you prefer a private burial.
At least I think I can say that none of the people who've told me how much they enjoyed this episode when they saw it were damaged by it.